Hi, it is Imogen Lamport from Inside Out Style, and today I was going to answer this question because it's been asked. It's a little bit complex. It's got a few nuances to it, so I thought what I'd do is I'd put together some slides so that you can actually see what I'm talking about. So I thought I'd do a little bit of kind of show and tell as such. So the question is all about, could you talk about negative space in fabrics and accessories? What is it about a person that harmonizes with negative space? Is this a yin quality? It seems ethereal, like I'm asking about what isn't there. And when you think about negative space, I think it is negative. But really, there's a lot of different forms of negative space in patterns and in accessories. So it's actually figuring out which is the right ones for you. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is what is negative space. So in prints and patterns, it is the space between the different prints and patterns. So these two here are very low negative space prints. The pattern doesn't really start or stop. It's very much all over. So there's really no negative space in them. These two in the middle have some negative space. So we've got these bits of pattern, and then we've got the bits in between. And so so in the middle we've got our kind of some negative space pieces, and then the rest are in between. So you'll find that these are going to draw attention. So what you notice, you look at this bit of print, you look at this bit of print, you look at this bit of print, and you look at this bit of print, and what's in between in the black with this is the negative space, and in here we've got the light pink and the negative space. These two on the right have got even more negative space around them, and so this is why the print really becomes the hero in that way. So we really see these large pieces of print in this shirt, and here basically the entire shirt is negative space apart from where the print is, and it creates a real focal point. So negative space can create more of a focal point wherever that print is placed. So when you're thinking about, what kind of print do I want? So if we have one which has got low negative space, this is always a more slimming print. It's a better print to put over a body part. You don't want people really being able to focus on. So if you want to use a print to hide some lumps and bumps or things like that, go for one like this with a very low negative space. But if you want to make that garment a focal point, a feature, something like this can be good, or, being aware of where the focal point is and are you happy with it. So if we notice with this top one here that when we look down, it does draw your eye down. And so I don't love this shirt because I think it actually has this downwards motion, and down here your hip becomes the focal point as well. So it is worthwhile, like standing there, like put the garment, like while you're looking at the garment, put it on a hanger and notice where that negative, like the print is taking you. Now, some other examples of negative space. So something like a leopard print is generally a pretty good all over print. And it is a more curvy print. So when we think about yin and yang, yin is more curvy, yang is more straight or sharp in its appearance as far as patterns go. So straighter lines tend to be more yang, more curvy lines tend to be more yin. So, here we have like a curvy all over print, again fairly dense, fairly low negative space, quite easy to wear. Here we've got something, you can see it's a little bit bolder, it's a little bit larger, and this is where scale comes into this. We need to think about not just yin and yang, but scale. So larger scale is always more yang, smaller scale is always more yin. So when we're looking at this one in the middle, the giraffe print, the giraffe, the edges and the little bits of sharpness stand off a little bit more. So it makes it, and it's a larger scale, so it makes it a more yang print. So the negative space is the dark bits in between, but that is something to think about, is what example of negative space you're after. And here we have a print which is really quite a high contrast, and high contrast is always more yang, even though this is kind of a curved print on the whole. But the high contrast is making these dark blobs the feature of the shirt. Now the thing when we've got to remember is we often think about, if light colors advance and dark colors recede, shouldn't the dark bits be the most receding? Now in the one in the middle it is, but on this one, because it's the less prominent part of the print and the negative, more of the negative space is actually kind of these background colors, then the dark bits actually become the focal point. So this is where, even though it may be dark, it is actually more yang and it can become the focal point. So it is something to be aware of, is where those things are. Now, on this slide, I've got 3 of the same tops, but they just got different prints. So this is where I'm going to talk about advancing and receding colors. So when we're thinking about colors, when we think about the, what's it called? What's it called? I'm trying to think what it's called here. So warm overtone colors advance and cool overtone colors recede. So when we are looking at that, if we are looking at cool overtone colors versus warm overtone colors, if we look at the one on the left, we've got the orange is the bit that grabs our attention first, because this is the warmest part of it. Then we have the green, which is also brighter and like it's more exciting. It's a yellow green. So again, that's the next thing we see in this print. So it becomes that the print is the feature. And then the white background, even though it's light, so remember, light colors advance and dark colors generally recede. But even though that's lighter than those 2 colors, what we're actually seeing then is that because the warmth of those colors is more advancing, that becomes the focal point. So the print is the focal point. And again here, where we've got a dark background, we've also got very warm colors, the print becomes a focal point. But what's interesting on this one on the right is that the background actually has become the focal point. The negative space has actually become the focal point of the print rather than the print, because it's a larger proportion of the print. So this is where we can think about the proportions of the print as well. So it's not just about the actual print as such, but also thinking about the proportions of the prints and exactly what we are seeing. So this is where it's more complex than you may realize when you are thinking about this. It really can be quite complex when we're deciding on which to wear. So here we've got some more examples of garments that have some negative space, and it's worthwhile thinking. So here we've got light versus dark, so light advancing and dark receding, and therefore the lighter parts of the print are tending to advance. And a part of this can be because the prints are in cool colors. So we've got cool overtone colors here with these blues. So more of the blues and things are receding. And what we actually notice is the advancing white parts. And this is why you've got to be very careful when you're choosing a print, that your negative space doesn't end up, say, somewhere that, like where we might think, oh, well, there's no pattern over the bust here. But in fact, these white spaces which are over the bust are actually starting to draw attention. So that is something to be aware of, is to be looking at where is the eye being drawn. And here we've got the hips is where the attention is drawn because the light is advancing. So even though this is the negative space from the print, it's actually grabbing attention. So you have to be careful. And here this is making the shoulders look smaller because it's a little bit darker. It's also making her shoulders look a little bit heavier. It's kind of weighing her down because dark colors have visual weight. So they weigh you down and they can actually shorten you a little bit. I think it would have been better if they'd actually had the dark here and the light up here, because that would draw attention up to her face, and this would make this part less of a feature, because most women generally don't want their stomach, hips and thigh area to be a focal point. And this is where there's a lot of what I call bad design out there in the marketplace that you need to be aware of. So this one here, what we've got is the pattern is much more dense in the bottom. So notice how your eye doesn't start and stop there. It doesn't stop on different features. But as we come up the bodice, we've noticed that we get much more negative space, and then we're lingering. The eye lingers on the different parts of the pattern, and because we've got that light background, that light negative print, that space, then what that actually is doing is that negative space is becoming the feature of the outfit rather than being the bit that disappears. So even though we may call it negative space, it's kind of just called negative because it's the bit that's the opposite of whatever is the pattern. And so when we're thinking about, say, a pattern like this, like, just be aware of where is your eye drawn. Is that a part of your body you want people to focus on, because it is creating a focal point. Now we can have the negative space actually creating the pattern. So when we think about things like lace and cutouts and burnout, those sorts of different fabrics, the negative space can actually start to create the pattern or the print. So when we look at the lace, the black is only noticeable because we've got this light background. So we're kind of looking at that negative space in between that creates the pattern there. And we've got this little cutout here. We can see that the cutout becomes the pattern, but it's a negative space that becomes the pattern because you notice this bit of pattern way more than this bit because the contrast between what she's wearing on the bottom versus her skin is greater, but they still gives a bit of like pattern there. And the same here with the lace. So here we've got this lace, and it's the mesh bits, it's the sheer bits that kind of create the focal point, so that negative space becomes the pattern. And again with this lace, you know, that without, you know, kind of that background, and we notice it so much more when we can see through it than when it's on a solid background. And even with something like this, is the spots are the pattern, but they only brought about, you know, you only really see them because of the sheerness of the other bit. So here we have, because it's tone on tone, and maybe it's something about this shirt and the spot, that the spot is the print, it's the feature, and the negative space is a bit more negative, it's less obvious. And sometimes the negative space can become the focal point. So if we're looking at things like cutouts, a cutout is kind of a little piece of negative space. So here we've got like a keyhole, and we've got a few keyholes here, and here we've got a little hole there, and that they actually become the focal point or the feature of the garment. So you want to make sure you're happy with that, where that keyhole is, where that little part is. It becomes a detail and becomes a feature. So it is really something to be aware of when you are looking at these sorts of garments, that yes, it may be negative space, and it's showing a bit more skin, which is probably a little bit more yin in many ways, but it is something to be thinking about. And also when we think about solid versus sheer, what I find interesting is it depends on what is the background. So if we've got some sheer fabrics, is the background solid like this? So it's a less obvious sheer, and then we can see her arms, they become, you know, the feature of her, versus here. And this is where it's the, you know, what is underneath, that wearing that black bra underneath this white shirt is really actually making her body the feature. The shirt becomes the background, her body becomes the feature, because we are looking through to that black bra, rather than if it was more like this, where she had a more solid tank or something, or here they've done a much more solid piece behind it. So it doesn't feel in the same way. So this is much more business-like, and this is much more playful. So of course you want to think about how it is expressing itself. Now we're looking at things like pieces of jewelry, that we have the space between the links on chains and things like this. So we want to think about the scale of your features. So if I've got larger facial features, and therefore I want to wear larger scale pieces, or I've got a larger bust, I can think about, well, what is the size? So this is a very solid chunky chain in the middle, versus this one here is a more fine chain. Now they may kind of almost take up the same amount of space, those links, you know, the width and everything is the same, but this one feels much more dramatic in a way than this one does, because of the space in between, because there's air coming through, so it is a little bit more ethereal, it is more yin, versus this one, because it's solid and chunky, is more yang. So remember that larger scale things are always more yang and more authoritative, versus smaller scale, more finer, more delicate is always more yin. So it depends on your personality of which you may choose, and also could depend on, this is going to suit someone with larger facial features, versus this one will suit someone with smaller facial features, because it's not overwhelming their facial features. And then we've got these multiple strands, which are very, very popular at the moment. So even though they take up more space, because they're very fine, they are more feminine and more yin in their expression. So depending on your personality, if you've got a more dramatic personality, you wouldn't go for something larger and chunkier, versus if you've got a more delicate, more feminine personality, you want to go for something much more fine. And this is where something like this works for someone who's got a more feminine personality, but maybe a large bust they want to distract from, but has smaller facial features, where we've still got the fineness, but we've also got a larger scale that helps you to kind of camouflage that bust, distract from that bust, versus this one is not going to distract from the bust because it's all smaller in scale. And then we can think about more traditional versus more modern, that if we think about our traditional pearl necklace, like this one here, it's very very traditional, very, you know, conservative, very classic. Versus if we go for something like this, we've got more spacing in between. So it's like we've got negative space between the beads. It is more feminine. So because this takes up more general space, it takes up more room as such. So it has a larger scale in that way, versus this has a smaller scale because of the space in between. So things like this is a little bit more yin, this is a little bit more yang. Not that it's particularly yang, but it's a little bit more in comparison. But we also see this as more traditional and this as more modern. And then looking at things like filigree, so small fine pieces, even though this is quite a large scale statement necklace, because it was made from many small fine little pieces, it doesn't feel as heavy or as dramatic as something like this does, which is very heavy and solid. So there's no space, there's no air in between. So I always think the more we can see a bit of air in between, it becomes more yin. The more it's solid, the more it becomes more yang, and more authoritative, more professional, stronger, more dramatic. And then thinking about angles versus curved. Again, angular things are more yang versus curved things are more yin. So when we're looking at a necklace like this, even though it's got space in it, the fact that it's diamond, so it's angular, and they're a decent size scale, makes it a more yang necklace than this one here, which is made from small curvy pieces. And even just each element, each line is much finer than these ones, which are thicker. So we've got to think about the size of the lines, the size of the details, and here we've got that spacing as well, which is again letting more air in, making it more feminine, more lightweight, which is more yin than something like this, which becomes more yang. It's stronger and more dramatic. So there you go.